Columbia takes a stand. In early May of 1863, General Robert E. Lee had just won the Battle of Chancellorsville in Maryland, but the Confederates were still outnumbered and undersupplied. Now Lee had two options. He could either retreat back to Richmond and stand siege, or advance into Pennsylvania with its rich farmlands. This would enable the people of Virginia to restock their supplies. Lee chose the latter and went on the offensive. Lee planned to capture Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and then march on to Washington, D.C. This would compel President Lincoln to recognize the Confederate States of America as its own country, thus winning the war for the South. Confederate General Jubal Early was leading his troops into western Pennsylvania, bent on attacking Harrisburg from the southeast, while General Richard Ewell attacked from the southwest. But first, Early had to cross the Susquehanna River, where a small contingent of untested Union troops took a stand and stopped the Confederates dead in their tracks. On June 10, 1863, Union Major General Darius N. Couch was assigned head of the Department of the Susquehanna. This department, under General Order No. 172, was created based on the assumption that the Susquehanna River was a logical line of defense. The Columbia-Wrightsville Bridge was the longest covered bridge of its time. It had railroad tracks, a towpath for animals pulling barges, and a path for carts and pedestrians. Columbia was a good prize for the Confederates to take, due to the fact that it had railroads to York, Harrisburg, and Philadelphia. As the Confederates advanced, they cut telegraph wires to Harrisburg in hope of isolating it. Now you may be wondering why the Confederates wanted Harrisburg. Well, it had the largest Union camp and an enormous supply depot. Special Order 14 stated, Colonel Jacob G. Frick, 27th Pennsylvania Volunteer, will proceed to Columbia and take charge of all bridges and fords on the Susquehanna River in Lancaster County and will make such dispositions as will effectively secure these crossings. Signed, D. N. Couch, Major General. Colonel Frick arrived in Columbia on June 24th. There were many calls to arms, even one from President Lincoln for 100,000 men, which were not successful. Most of the men who Frick had were convalescents, untrained, or had not seen battle. On June 25th, Frick had 1-mile-long trenches dug in a horseshoe shape around Wrightsville. On the turnpike leading into Wrightsville, iron ore railroad cars had been placed as a blockade. On the bridge, Carpenter Robert Crane and 19 men he hired bored holes in the wooden arches, filled them with gunpowder, and attached fuses. Altogether, these were called mines. Their purpose was to demolish the fourth span of the bridge if the Union defenses did not hold. Another defensive measure taken was the installation of railroad cars at the front of the bridge, wide enough to allow retreating Union soldiers to slip through, but preventing a Confederate cavalry dash. If the Confederates tried to rebuild the bridge, the Union would shoot cannon from the Columbia side. Unfortunately, no cannon shells arrived before the Confederates came. Back in early June, people in the area surrounding Wrightsville started to flee, and as the Confederates drew closer, the refugee traffic across the bridge got heavier. Some had herds of animals, and it could take a day for it to be your turn to cross the bridge. The Columbia Bank, which owned the bridge, collected a lot of money from tolls. Meanwhile, Confederate General Jubal Early and General John Brown Gordon were marching toward York. Union Major Granville Owen Haller was in York until it surrendered, and then left for Wrightsville 350 men. When Haller arrived on June 27th, he went to the bank and told them to drop the toll, which they did. Major Haller wanted to have soldiers on the hills around Wrightsville. Unfortunately, to do this, they would have needed 3 times the amount of soldiers they had. The Union had no idea of the size of the approaching force. The defenses were good against raids of cavalry and infantry, but not against cannon fire. On June 28th, the Confederates took York. General Early demanded of the townspeople $100,000, but the town could only give him $28,000. A little girl, about 12, gave General Gordon a bouquet of flowers with a mysterious note hidden in it that had the position of the Union defenses. The note's handwriting looked like an older woman's. On that same day, General Gordon, who was commanding 1,800 men and 4 cannon, left for Wrightsville. Gordon placed men and cavalry in a ravine to the right of the bridge, which extended past the left flank of the Union defenses. This ravine had been in the note. Frick was in the front rifle pits with the 27th Pennsylvania Militia. Two other Union leaders, Sickles and Greene, were on the right and left of Frick. It was 5:30 when the first shot rang out. Union Captain Stewart had put sentries on the turnpike. However, they were not hard to beat back. Major Haller observed, "The enemy advanced very slowly, feeling their way and occasionally firing," which Jarman returned. The Confederates stealthily approached through the woods and wheat fields. Colonel Frick saw some Confederates emerge from the woods 300 yards from the Susquehanna. They were now on the left and right of the Union defenses. Colonel Frick knew that when the Confederates charged, he and his men would be cut off. At 6:50 p.m., the front defenders delivered heavy gunfire and started to retreat toward the bridge. The Confederates opened fire with their artillery upon Wrightsville. The first shell, a present from the Confederates, blew up over the town. At first, the rebels tried to drop their shells into the trenches, but then turned their attention to the retreating soldiers. All of the defenders fled over the bridge, except for about 20 of Colonel Sickles' men. Major Haller was preparing for the possibility that the Confederates might capture the bridge. If they did so, he would defend Columbia. To prevent the Confederates from crossing the bridge, Union Major Charles McClellan Knox ordered that the fuses attached to the mines on the bridge be lit. The bridge rumbled and shook, but did not collapse as planned. Colonel Frick later said, "It was then that I felt it to be my duty, in order to prevent the enemy from crossing the river and marching on to Harrisburg in the rear, destroying on his route railroads and bridges, to order that the bridge be set on fire." Crude oil had been poured on the floor in case such drastic measures were deemed necessary. The man who lit the fire was Jacob Miller, a black man who was part of Robert Crane's demolition crew.
When Colonel Frick lowers that sword and that one black man with that cigar between his fingers and he flicks that on that coal oil, he wasn't thinking of just burning the bridge. He was thinking about his family. He was thinking about the going back into slavery. He had to take a stand against them, or it would have been incomplete in his life. His young children. He knew he was in a free town, that he could be free, and that was probably the most emotional thing you could have in the Civil War, is have that black man flick that cigar on that coal oil to make a stand against them. Could you imagine if you were the only black man, a free slave on that bridge that day, and you see Gordon's brigade come up with 3,000 soldiers knowing you're going to go back to slavery? I think I'd make a major stand for that.
The fire was spreading towards both towns, consuming the whole bridge. As the fire approached Wrightsville, the rebels hastily tried to collect buckets and pails, but they couldn't find any. Even the town fire engine was missing. The townspeople said that the Union soldiers had carried them away. General Gordon commented that there was, however, no lack of buckets and pails a little later when the town was on fire. People saw the smoke and flames of the burning bridge for miles. One of those people was Confederate General Jubal Early. Early realized that his chances of crossing the Susquehanna and taking Harrisburg were crumbling into the river. The fire burned for 4 hours, and the total loss of buildings destroyed in Wrightsville was $13,000. General Early told General Gordon to return to York the next day. Early stated in his report that the entire plan was thwarted because the bridge was burned. On June 29th, the Union was preparing for a potential amphibious invasion until a boat from the Wrightsville side, full of civilians, told them that the Confederates had already left. Now General Early was going to meet up with General Ewell at a small town called Gettysburg, all because a small contingent of Union soldiers and the brave citizens of Columbia took a stand and stopped the Confederates from potentially winning the war.